welcome to another episode of I Demand a Homestead. My name is Amanda, and today we're going to be talking about something that over the years I have been reflecting on kind of more and more, which is how to protect my vegetable garden and my fruit garden for that matter from the effects of kind of a changing climate. So we're going to kind of talk about what you can do to plan in advance and to even kind of try and deal with what you've got right now. I'm going to say that the first thing to do is actually pay attention to what your climate is like. So what I have is I have a gardening journal that I use where I actually will document the temperatures and then also the amount of rainfall. And that way I've got like a 10-year garden journal where I can actually compare, and I'll write like at the beginning, the first of each month, I'll write kind of how the weather was for that previous month. And that way I can compare year to year. And what I have noticed from doing that is my climate tends to be one that fluctuates a lot. Okay, so we can kind of have like, you may find that your climate is kind of up and down. You may find that you're always getting droughts. You may find that your climate is always too hot. The weather is just always too hot. So depending on what your weather and your climate is, you'll kind of need to make different choices about what you're going to do. Like for us, we had a really cold, dry spring. Then we had a heat wave that was also dry. And then we've been kind of cool and wet for the rest of the year, which again is really strange. Last year it was really dry, really hot. So the things that you can do is, for one thing, you can try and pick different varieties of plants that are more resistant to the changes that you're noticing. So if you're always kind of hot and dry, try and pick plants and crops that are actually resistant to that kind of weather. All right, so that's a good start. For me, because things go up and down, I need to pick things that are both heat loving, but also cold, kind of cool weather loving, so that way, if one kind of crop doesn't do as well, like this year my heat loving stuff is not doing as well, but my like cool season crops like my kale and my Brussels sprouts have gone crazy. So that way you always know that you're going to have something that's doing well, right? Okay? So that's kind of number one. You're going to pick the right varieties. So regardless of what kind of weather you are having, I have found that the best thing that you can do to kind of to have a successful outcome is to use mulch. Mulching in the rows of your garden, in between, but also around your plants. And that's great because it is going to shade the soil, keep the soil kind of moist as well, and reduce the amount of water that you need. If you get a really, really heavy rain, it also doesn't allow that soil to kind of splatter up onto your plants and cause fungal diseases. So regardless, too dry, too wet, mulch, I think, is the right answer. Okay. The other thing that you want to think about is kind of creating different microclimates, or little areas of the garden where the weather is going to be better, or the temperatures and the amount of sun are going to be better for your crops. So if you tend to get too much sun or it's too hot, what you want to try and think about is creating some areas of shade. So in the long run, if you have trees, don't cut them down. Because you may find that gardening close to your trees, creating some shade in that really, really hot part of the day for your vegetables, or not so much for your fruit trees, but for your vegetables, that's a great thing. Or if you don't have any trees, you can plant some. It might be a little bit before they will shade out the areas that you want, but you can kind of plan in advance and make sure that you're planting trees. In the short term, if you need to create some shade, you can use something like a tunnel, like a trellis tunnel. So where you've got a plant that climbs up really, really quickly, that will create shade for things underneath that are less sun tolerant. So for example, I have got my bean tunnel, but then I also have my tomato tunnel. And then kind of underneath that, I've planted lettuce, because lettuce is really not that tolerant to sun. And so that way it kind of, they both get exactly what they need, right? The tomatoes want the sun, so they're up higher. The lettuce wants the shade, and so it's where it needs to be. The other thing you can do to create a little bit of a microclimate is plant intensively. So that means that like we've got those 30-inch wide rows with 18-inch wide pathways, and you can kind of see here I'm using the example of my beets, but the beets are planted very, very close together. There's 3 rows of beets in there, and once they come up, I mean, they suppress the weeds, which is awesome, but they also shade, the plants themselves, they shade the soil, so that way the soil stays kind of cooler and moister, and that's a really, really great kind of way to reduce the amount of water that you use on those areas. Lastly, if you really, really kind of have a lot of heat, you can look at kind of a shade cloth, which a lot of people will put over their gardens using like a trellis, or some kind of something to put the shade cloth on that you can have for the hottest months of your gardening, and then when it gets a little bit cooler, you can take that shade cloth off. Depending on how long your gardening season is, that can be a great thing to do. We don't have that much heat here in Ontario and Canada, so for me it's not been relevant, but who knows in the future, right? That may be something that I have to consider. In addition, if you know that you tend to get kind of times of drought, or your rainfall is a little bit more variable, what you can do is you can harvest your rainwater using rain barrels. If it's like a really, really serious problem, you can think about getting a cistern. A cistern is kind of like an underground tank where if you have times of the year where you get more rain, you kind of harvest it and store it so that way you can use it later. If you're just doing the rain barrel system, which is what I do, then you can either water by hand using a watering can, or if you have like a submersible pump, you can use that to run a sprinkler or some kind of like a low pressure water delivery system as well. So that's one thing you can do. Something that I haven't done as much, but I'm going to start doing, is I've noticed that we don't have as many bees and as many pollinators around here as we used to, sadly, which is probably because of a lot of pesticide use. So what I'm going to try and do, for one thing, don't use pesticides if you can get away with it, right? So use as little as possible and use the least toxic option that you can. You know, you can use row covers, you can use lots of other things to try and kind of avoid the use of pesticides, because they are being detrimental to our pollinators and our bee populations. So with that in mind, with the fact that there's fewer bees, I need to attract them to my garden so that way they're going to pollinate my crops, and I'm going to get better crops. So I'm going to try a little bit more kind of what they call companion planting with flowers, so that way, hopefully kind of at the top of each row, I'm going to have a few flowers, so that way that's going to kind of hopefully lure the bees to my garden, and then they'll help pollinate things a little bit better. And then last but not least of the things that I can kind of think about that I'm doing is soil is another great way to sequester or kind of lock in carbon, which is going to reduce the amount of climate changes that we have in the future. So a great way to kind of sequester more carbon is to avoid tilling your soil and practicing using a no-till garden, which is okay, because every time you turn over the soil, you're releasing more carbon into the atmosphere. And beyond that, just trying to reduce your carbon footprint in general is a good idea, you know, because it just is a good idea. All right, so let me know if you guys have got other things that you're doing to kind of climate-proof your vegetable or your fruit gardens, because I would be really happy to know kind of what you found that works well for you. This is just the stuff that I've been doing, and as time changes, I think I'm going to have to kind of always try and stay one step ahead or maybe just one step behind the changes as they're coming. All right, guys, so if you like this video, please feel free to press the subscribe button, as well as the notification bell, so that way you never miss another one of my videos. And I hope everybody's having a great day and that you're getting out there into your garden. All right, everyone, take care. Bye-bye.